Welcome to episode 99 of Seize the Moment podcast. And we wanted to welcome back a very special guest. We have Emmy van Deurzen today. As you know, she's an existential psychotherapist, philosopher, and counseling psychologist. She's principal of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling at the Existential Academy in London and runs her own private therapy practice, Dilemma Consultancy, in London. She's a visiting professor with Middlesex University, for whom she directs several doctoral and master's programs. She's published 17 books on existential therapy and the challenges of the human condition. Her work has been translated into more than a dozen languages, and she has lectured worldwide in more than 35 countries across all continents. Her new book is called Rising From Existential Crisis, Life Beyond Calamity. Welcome, Emmy.
Thank you very much.
And then, absolutely. Yeah, we have a copy here too.
You've got it too.
And so what's so cool about having you back on to talk about this book is literally, so for our listeners who've been kind of following us a little bit consistently. So when we ended off our last conversation, I'm not sure if you remember, Emmy, in I think it was September 2019, we literally ended off on Brexit. So we kind of got cut off because Yeah. So we kind of we cut the show a little bit short just because obviously we were worried that it was going too long. And so we started talking about Brexit. And what's perfect is that now we get to pick up on it. So the first question is going to be, Emmy, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of Brexit and just the firsthand account of what you've been going through the past couple of years?
Yes. So the book talks about this because that's how I got into the book, to become aware of the huge number of people who had been plunged into crisis in their personal lives because of the Brexit referendum. So I am speaking about the 5 million European citizens who had made their lives in the United Kingdom. And I should add, on top of that, there are 1.5 million British citizens who made their lives in the European Union, who have also had a very hard time. But I have focused particularly on the EU citizens who live in the United Kingdom because I'm one of them. And I immediately became aware that my position in the UK was no longer safe after the referendum. I had completely taken it for granted. I've been in the United Kingdom for over 40 years, and it's my home country, as it were. You know, I don't think of it in any other way. But there suddenly, the way in which the referendum was conducted and the consequences of it meant that there was a kind of xenophobia which exploded in the country, and we were suddenly being treated as unwelcome strangers and immigrants. And quite frankly, people were very rude and very unpleasant and said really horrible things like, well, we don't want you here anymore. You're stealing our jobs. Why don't you just go back to where you came from? Or why don't you just go back home? Well, of course, going back home is a nonsense. My home is in the United Kingdom. And exactly the same experience happened for millions of other people in that position. And it was shocking because none of us had ever in our wildest nightmares really imagined that we would be on the wrong end of racism, essentially. You know, many of us, for being from different countries, are very aware of the importance of diversity and openness to international exchanges and that sort of thing. But to find yourself suddenly at the wrong end of that, it's really a shock to the system, I can tell you. There were days when I thought, basically, I might get thrown out of the country. And I felt the need to become a UK citizen in order to safeguard myself. But when I applied for UK citizenship, I was refused. So then my shock was even greater, and it started to feel like some kind of Kafkaesque scenario, you know. I had created organizations. I employ, 100 people. I'm married to a Brit. I've paid taxes for over 40 years. How on earth could they refuse me? I thought it must be a mistake. So I simply protested and asked for them to reconsider it. And I was quite sure that it would be okay. But then it wasn't. I was refused again. And then I began to panic and I began to realize that something very unpleasant was at work and that I really couldn't take anything for granted any longer. I joined lots of organizations. I became aware of the thousands of people like me who were panicking and feeling helpless, and some were getting depressed, and many of them couldn't sleep anymore. Insomnia really was rife amongst them. And so we set up a special support service for people in that situation. And I also set up a Facebook group called Voices for Europe, which has several thousands of people in it. And so I became more and more aware of the real distress that was happening. Now it became a double thing for me. On the one hand, I felt this was a human rights issue and I needed to fight, which I did. I engaged politically very strongly, and I did strange things like giving political speeches by the Houses of Parliament with an audience of 500,000 people, and leading protest marches and screaming in the streets. Quite interesting. But on the other hand, I became aware of the distress this caused. And as a psychotherapist and a psychologist, it became also interesting to me, because what I saw happening in front of my eyes is what I have written about for so many years, that mental and emotional difficulties are not just about the intrapsyche. They're not about the person's issues. They are about how we are in the situation, how we are in society. And they are also, I realized, about what the state does to us. That pressure that the state exercises on a group of people can lead to many people in that group going under. So not only did I then continue working with these people to try help with this, but also I began to research it, obviously, and some of my students were doing very interesting research projects. One on the military personnel that had been in active service during the Falklands War and who had seen their mates being killed in front of their eyes. And this student had followed them up and had realized that although many had coped really well in the moment, over decades, they had all divorced their wives, every single one of them. They couldn't communicate with other people. They were basically completely isolated in a negative kind of universe. And so I began to realize that these things are really, really important. This is not just about trauma. This is about finding yourself disconnected from the world, finding yourself pushed by the state or by political events into an isolated, disenfranchised position from where communication with other people becomes impossible, and therefore your system starts to shut down. And this is exactly what we saw all over the shop. So many people who'd never had any mental health problems before became deeply, deeply distressed, couldn't function. Some became quite phobic, some even became suicidal. It's really quite an extraordinary picture to see this happening in millions of people at the same time. I'm sure you could have done the same thing in the USA during the Trump era. Some people were deeply affected by that. Mexican immigrants who were pushed out of the country, there must have been a tremendous toll on mental health. I haven't looked into it, but it would be interesting to see that.
Yeah.
And of
I mean,
course, similar
just
things could be done with service personnel who were in various other wars. You know, the Vietnam War, that's being researched incredibly intensively, and it has had a similarly terrible effect on people. Same with Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, just from personal experiences, the people that we've known that are like of Hispanic origins, especially since I think in the beginning of 2016, all of them were, even people who were US citizens at the time, were incredibly worried that they were going to be deported.
Yeah, exactly. And once you live with that kind of very fundamental insecurity in your life, where the agency in your life is taken away by the state, and you don't know what the future holds, and there is no longer a sense that you can do anything about it, that really, really knocks you for a loop, that really changes the way you find yourself in the world considerably.
I mean, it feels that way with the pandemic, with the lockdowns, being cut
Exactly.
off from each other. You know, that sort of isolation.
Yeah,
Right.
what I think is so pretty horrifying was, and I think this is pretty much one of the most difficult parts of your book to kind of swallow, is the fact that some of these, so people obviously who are refugees are already struggling because, you know, they're kind of isolated from their homeland.
Exactly.
They're isolated, right, from their families. And then on top of that, now they're coming into a new country, and there's this double isolation where, so now you're kind of disconnected from your homeland, but then on top of that, now you're disconnected, obviously, because of the pandemic and, you know, kind of xenophobia going on, you're disconnected from your potential new home. So, I
Yes.
mean, Emmy, from your experiences, how have some of these refugees been dealing with these crises?
Well, that's really interesting. So another one of my students, who is himself a political refugee from Iran, did his research on Iranian political refugees in the United Kingdom. And what he found is that what makes the difference is if people have this ideological belief that they're doing the right thing, that they're making a stand, that they're well, basically giving their life over to getting away from a regime that is oppressive, and that they're making a kind of statement. It's a blow for freedom, as it were, and that is what can carry them through, and to then organize themselves with other like-minded people and to find a way to communicate about their plight and about what it is all about. Then they can thrive and they do better. Having said that, many of these people had to sacrifice their home life, their families, their spouses, their children in some cases. But the fact that they were able to act on their beliefs and go somewhere with it, as it were, made it possible for them to do well out of it psychologically. And that's the same thing we saw with the EU citizens, the ones that found a way to join the fight, as it were, to engage with what was going wrong and to write about it or speak up about it, or even just post on social media about it and join up with other people. They did a lot better than the ones that became isolated and that gave up. So the whole idea about solidarity and a sense of belonging still to a group of people that will hold you up and that will give you a reason to live for, that is what makes the difference. It's not psychotherapy that makes the difference. It's how you re-engage with your life, how you rebuild that world that has been attacked and that has been disorganized, and how you reorganize that to find a purpose and to find a connection and to find an audience, to find a group that receives you in a positive way. Because the worst thing is to feel like an outcast and to feel that you're no longer wanted and that you do not belong any longer. I think that is when it really goes haywire for many people.
Yeah, it must have been maddening. Talking about, for example, being potentially deported to someone who this wasn't affecting at all. they probably, I remember somewhere in your book, you mentioned that people weren't even that interested in that level of conversation. And that to you was shocking, right?
Very shocking,
Yeah.
really, really shocking. I felt that even sometimes in the Remain movement, in other words, the British people who had wanted to stay part of Europe, when we started to talk about our problems as EU citizens, they didn't want to hear about it. So the first injustice was that in the referendum vote, the 5 million of us, some of us, as I said, who've been here for decades, weren't given a vote, which seems incredibly unjust because we had a vote in other elections. So why not in this referendum, which was going to decide about our own futures? That seemed so unjust. But when we spoke up about that, even before the referendum, people who were in favor of Remain winning would say no, because people would find that the vote was unfair because there were so many EU citizens who were allowed to vote, or they would say worse things. What was often said to me was, but don't you understand? Now we have to look after our own. And then I'd say, but where do you draw the line? Who is your own and who isn't your own? How many years do I have to have worked in Britain to be able to call myself one of you? Where do you decide in what part of your mind is it right to just decide to eliminate some of the people that are your neighbors, that are your friends, that are your colleagues? It seemed so sharp to me that this line was being drawn in that way. It was really shocking because, we never were immigrants. When we moved to the UK, all 5 million of us, we were part of the European Union and we
Right.
had freedom of movement. You could live anywhere you wanted. So we didn't immigrate. We didn't have to prove anything. But then suddenly it changed. We became different in people's eyes. And I
It's
think it was that different. It was that feeling of being denigrated, of being made into second or third class citizens when we had been equal. That is what was such a shock.
it was strange to me that even the home office where you would submit your documents to, I'm not even sure. It seemed like you had everything you would have needed to
Oh, yes, I
prove that you
did.
lived there.
Yes, I had absolutely everything. And, we were all the same. We all did this very rigorously and thoroughly. And it's forms of dozens and dozens of pages. You had to show your finance over 6 years. You had to show everything, all the travel you had done, everything. It's a very big job. And you don't do that in a haphazard way. But then to have that just rejected back in your face when you've just paid £1,000, for your application fee is
Right.
really quite horrific. And it makes you feel as if there's no more ground under your feet, as if the rules of the world have changed and the goalposts have been moved, and they're just not going to have you as part of that society anymore. They just want to put you in a different place.
What
So, it's very eye-opening. It opened my eyes very much to what my parents had been through in the Second World War, and in terms of what had been done not just to the Jewish people but also to the gypsies, to the disabled, to intellectuals, to communists, lots of people who had suddenly been turned into second-class citizens and had been deported. It felt a bit like that. Also, it made us all intensely sympathetic towards the Black population, towards that whole battle against racism, because we suddenly felt like, hey, this is the same thing, we've become undesirables. We're second rate. We're looked at askance. They don't want us in these jobs. They don't want us in these houses. this was the ridiculous thing. You wouldn't believe it. But, several of my friends had difficulties buying houses. They couldn't get a mortgage anymore. They couldn't compete equally for jobs anymore because employers would get suspicious and say, well, how do I know that you'll still be here next year? You guys may have to go back home. So everything was twisted and changed.
And one of the most kind of inspirational aspects of your book was Joan's story. And so I remember you telling, well, I think this was the part where he was telling us part of the story. So he said that essentially, oh no, I'm actually wrong. No, I think it was your end of the story where you were talking about, you mentioned how he was able to overcome his anger. So the fact that he was angry is obviously kind of ubiquitous here, right? So in the US, we're highly polarized. Everybody kind of hates everybody. So, you kind of understand how we're not able to, not even willing to see the other side. But what was so interesting and so really remarkable about Joan's story was that somehow, as you worked with him as his therapist, that you guys were somehow able to come to a point of understanding for the remainers. Because here, I can tell you, I can't speak for Alan, but it's very hard for me to understand the conservative perspective. So Alan is very good at that. So Alan is very good at trying to actually sit down and really kind of deeply find the roots of really, really difficult and polarizing views, right? I don't do that. So,
I mean, just to tag that a bit, I mean, if somebody is so certain of their point of view that they're willing to defend it to the death, right? As if it's their own identity.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder what are their reasons? What are their rationalizations?
Exactly. Yes, right. It's crucial to be able to do that as a psychotherapist, isn't it? In principle, you should be able to be a therapist to anybody and understand any point of view, any perspective. You may not agree with it, but you should be able to be attentive, to be available, and to work out where it comes from, why it matters, why it is important, and where perhaps there's something irrational. But yes, that was a real achievement. You're right. When he began to be able to speak to the Brexiters and to not feel angry with them anymore and to actually begin to feel sympathetic towards them, because he realized that at the end of the day, we've all been played by, the people in power. Most people in the population need the same things. We all want safety. We all want work that we enjoy. We all want to be able to live with their families, with our friends, have some good times in life. We don't want to have to worry about falling into poverty. We want health care. It's not complicated. We're all on the same side. We want basically the same things, but we are manipulated into believing that we want different things, or rather that people on the other side want different things to us and that they're a threat to us. They're not. There are very few people who are a threat to us. The people who are a threat to us are the people who own most of the world and who are trying to manipulate other people into it staying that way. Mm-hmm. But, fundamentally, if we speak to each other and we take down our barriers, we find that we're basically in the same boat.
Absolutely. And just to get into philosophical territory a little bit, what do we mean by existential crises?
Yes, so existential crisis is a crisis of your existence, of your life. But I have specified it as meaning that several layers of your life are affected. So if you have a crisis, a normal crisis, and it is just a physical thing or it is just a social thing, you have enough equilibrium to kind of manage it. But when something hits you that tears across all the layers of your life, so you're no longer physically secure, as in the EU citizens suddenly feeling they might not be able to stay in the country. Your social world is ripped apart, so you might lose your job, which is, what was happening. Your personal layer is ripped apart. You begin to doubt yourself. You think maybe it's your fault what is happening. Your internal world is starting to fall apart. And especially your spiritual world is that ripped apart, i.e., you stop finding meaning in things. It makes no sense any longer. and somehow you lose your faith, not in God, or maybe also in God if you believed in God, but in humanity, in very basic things, like you lose faith in justice, or in the possibility of people understanding you, or you lose faith in human kindness or freedom, or, big things like that all become distorted and ripped apart. Then you really are going through an existential crisis. And of course, in the book, I explain how that can happen in many, many different ways. It can happen through having an accident. It can happen through a natural disaster. It can happen through war. It can happen through, what often happens in people's life in midlife crisis, for instance, is that they might change their job and then the new job doesn't work out, their marriage breaks up, they suddenly have no more income, no more home, no more family. That's an existential crisis too.
Yeah.
The point is, though, that we need to recognize it and not immediately start to speak about being traumatized, but recognize that we're dealing with a crisis situation and then know what it is we need to do, i.e. reestablish our equilibrium at all those different levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like we tend to have such a black and white view of crises where we think, life is terrible now as opposed to where it was before. So what I really appreciated is you telling the story of your childhood trauma and your articulation that the trauma itself and the crises was a little bit, so it wasn't so much a distinction, or it wasn't a kind of let me see how I could phrase this. It wasn't so much of a I guess distinction is a good term. So it wasn't so much a distinction from the past as it was a revelation of past sort of struggles and past issues. So I loved how you told the story about the kind of issues that you sort of buried deep down while you were obviously, kind of going through your childhood, the kind of issues that you were having with your family and being so tight knit with them, the struggles with your sister being a bully, and all of those things were sort of out of mind because you were trying to survive. And whereas this trauma became kind of a revelation to you. So even though it compounded these issues, at the end of the day, they had to have been dealt with at some point. So can you speak a little bit about that and how trauma and crisis is actually... You're welcome.
Bringing that up, I think that is so vital, really, to recognize that we tend to press things down. Yeah, we tend to keep things under control and keep the ship on an even keel. But when a crisis happens, we can't do that. Everything is upside down for a bit. And what that means is that we have to find our bearings again. And it also means usually that things stop for a bit. We have to slow down. We have to think. We have to take some time out. We have to understand where everything is coming from, what has gone wrong, how that is hitting the situation we used to be in, what is still salvageable, what isn't, what needs to be jettisoned. And so a process of reflection and a process of opening up of what we used to take for granted starts to happen. And in that process, true transformation becomes possible in a way that isn't possible without that kind of crisis, because we're too resistant to change. We do not like to allow that kind of transformation into our lives. If we can get away with it, we avoid it. But when it happens out of the blue and we can't avoid it anymore, then we can make the most of it rather than getting into a panic or thinking now everything is lost. We must remember this is actually a moment where things can be looked at again and we can reorder our existence in a new way. And this is what I've demonstrated both through the story of my own life, where I am sure my life opened up a lot when I had my accident at the age of 10 and had a sort of near-death experience, because everything was up for scrutiny. And of course, I had a lot of isolation and loneliness during that period in hospital. So I had to learn to reflect on things, and I had to learn to make sense of things by myself. And I think I acquired that habit, which is vital in a crisis. And this is what existential therapists can do for people in a crisis, provide them with that platform of calm where they can take that time, sit with the problem, not try to find the solutions, but try to get a sense of perspective, understand where all the changes are happening and how those might work out for the good in your life, and what things of the past you might want to throw out while you're at it, and how you might want to reorientate yourself for the rest of your life and have this new motivation, this new purpose, this new goal. And this is what we saw happening with some of the people, not all of the people, not everyone was quite able to do that yet, but some of the people who came to see us in our support service began to see this, that really, and you know, a bit like when I was 10, a lot of these people said things like, well, you know, I've lived in Britain for 15 years now. And I realized that really, although I thought I was equal, I never quite felt really like I was accepted. And what was that really about? And then they began to recognize that when you move countries, you do go into that with a bit of extra humility, and you do tend to adjust and adapt rather more than you should. And you become overly modest. And they began to realize that actually they had that kind of ghetto mentality for longer than the crisis, that predated the crisis, but the crisis revealed it. The crisis revealed it and tore it apart. They couldn't keep it covered up anymore. Now they knew that they weren't at ease. Now they knew that this was partially because of what was happening in Britain, but it was also partially because they had chosen to become a migrant, to live in a new country, to adjust to a new language, which is a bloody big deal, let me tell you, and to therefore swallow their pride maybe rather too often. And that allowed them to stand up stronger and to decide what they wanted to do. And there are many people who decided to leave the country. Thousands and thousands and thousands of EU citizens decided to go back to another continental country in Europe, not always their country of origin, but they just didn't want to be in that position any longer. And I can't blame them. I really understand it. So that is what you get out of a crisis if you allow yourself to live it to the hilt, to the full, and to really allow yourself to be transformed by it for the better.
Right. And I think for a lot of us, I know I struggle with this, maybe Alan, you do too, but it's like a sort of a lack of confidence in the ability to handle particular crises. So what I really loved, another thing I really loved about your personal story was that my assessment of it was, I thought that when you finally had that accident, I think you finally realized that those like other issues that you were having, which much easier to resolve than actually, you know, surviving and fighting for your life in the hospital.
This is true. This is true. Yeah, I hadn't quite seen that, but that is very true. These things were dwarfed in a way by the idea that I might have died.
Right. And it's like, Alan, have you ever had anything like that where you felt like, you know, so something like really terrible happened to you and then you were kind of dealing with other issues and then you figured, you know what, man, maybe the other stuff isn't that hard.
I mean, sure, yeah. When, you know, facing a death in the family, let's say.
Exactly.
Of course, wondering how I look in the mirror. What does this person think of me? What does that person think of me? When somebody's dying or somebody's in the hospital or something like that, your awareness completely zooms out. These small petty things are not even an issue.
Exactly that. Exactly that. I know after that, you know, from the age of 11, 12, I often had this thought, you know, if I thought somebody doesn't like me or I'm not part of the most popular kids in the class, I'd think, who cares? It doesn't matter. All that matters is that I keep going and I do the right things and I read the right things and I make something of my life because I know it matters. And I knew that forever after that. And it put a lot of things into perspective. And I think it also gave me the courage, you know, to move from the Netherlands to France, which was hard.
Right.
You know, speaking French instead of Dutch is pretty big change, and to adjust to the south of France when you've grown up in the north of Europe is a pretty big change. And then again from France to England, that again is a big shift. But throughout those things, I was always aware that it was nothing by comparison to having a death threat in your life, and, you know, having to deal as a kid with really important issues that you couldn't really get your head around completely, but that began dawning on you gradually in your, you know, 10-year-old mind, what was really going on.
Right. Oh, when do you feel like you finally figured out that you had to stand up to your sister and were able to do it?
Well, that's a long story, you know. That's another book, I think. I can't quite go there yet
I
because
hear you.
that's a very, very long story.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, never just your sister. It's about what that represents in the world. As you both know just as well as I do, there are always bullies in the world, and there are always people that come into your life in various capacities that mess with your life in some way, or that form a threat to you or the other people in your life, or maybe to your children. Or these things are part of human existence.
Yeah.
Not everybody is a nice guy.
Yeah.
This,
Yeah.
I used to think, you know, we're all equal, we're all well intentioned. If I'm nice to people, they'll be nice to me, but it isn't true. It just isn't true. Some people really just want to get advantage, and you got to learn to deal with it. And
Right.
you got to learn to deal with it sooner rather than later.
Right.
And
And I
it's
think,
about recognizing it, isn't it?
and I think we
But
both, I think both of us really appreciated your understanding of them and your kind of articulation of emotions, because people often think of like anger as a really negative emotion.
oh,
But if you're looking at anger in the context of bullying, then standing up for yourself is actually an indicator of self-esteem and that you deserve to be treated well.
most definitely, most definitely. Yes, I had never really shown any anger until I was 18 and I arrived
Wow.
in France. And then, you know, in the south of France, the people I knew there, they were so easy with their anger. It was a whole different ball game. And I just learned to use that. And then gradually, you know, learning to turn anger into self-assertion and being strong with it. But I think it did help me a lot to spend, you know, 7 years living in France in a culture where people are so upfront with their emotions, because I do think it helps enormously not to suppress the emotions, but to learn to sieve them for the gold in them. Every emotion has something of value in it. And if you can take that, harvest it, as it were, well, you know, harvest it and make wine out of it, let's say, that's a very good idea. It's not a good idea to suppress emotions. We know that all too well in psychotherapy, don't we? But it's not a good idea to teach people just to have their emotions either. And it's certainly not a good idea to get people to exaggerate their emotions, or to get into loops with their emotions, or to think of themselves as having a particular emotion that characterizes them, because that's simply not true. Every human body is capable of the whole range of emotions. All of us are. But by habit, we become stuck in certain ones, or we become incapable of expressing certain ones. So it's a learning process to get at ease with each of those, to understand what they tell you, and to turn them into some kind of constructive action in the world, rather than remain in the reactivity. So turn the reactivity into activity and into directionality, into purposefulness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, many people live their life as a no to things, right? Just living in reaction.
Yeah,
But yeah, and to make
absolutely.
exactly, and to make the choice to be proactive, to have your own set of values, see the world through your own fresh set of eyes, not to have your beliefs dictated to you by society or by a certain group of people, or for instance, those people who are xenophobic, for instance, and just went along with the group think, didn't necessarily try to critically think about the situation, go through the
Mhm.
nuance. What are these people who are on the in the out group? What are they experiencing? What are
Mhm.
their feelings like? They don't go that deeply into it. They just want to be, with the people who they can just identify with, and it's just safe, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's going to become a bigger and bigger problem, I think, in this world, because there's more and more people in the world, and there's going to be more and more pressure on us, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic. But, the climate crisis stuff is going to get pretty hot over the next decades.
Mhm.
And what that means is there will be large group of people who will have to become refugees for geographic reasons, and there's going to be an immigration problem all around the world, and there's going to be large groups of people who will say, oh, well, you're on your own, mate. That's too bad. This is what's happened in your country. We can't have you because there is no room left in our country. These are problems of the future. This is going to happen more and more and more, and we'll get mixed together more and more, and we're going to have to learn to deal with that in a fair-minded way, where we don't eliminate people, because of where they're coming from or the circumstances that pressurize them, and yet find a way not to become oppressed by it ourselves, because there will be pressure and tension for all of us. It's going to be harder than we think, I think, in the future.
Yeah. And heading back into philosophical territory, how have COVID, let's say COVID, the refugee crisis, and Brexit, how have they made people begin to face and kind of acknowledge these ultimate givens of existence? And how do we begin to deal with them?
Yeah, well, this is where I'm hopeful. I am hopeful that this pandemic is doing something like that. It is a moment of waking up for a lot of people. People are aware that they just can't take it for granted that we can live in a world where we live in plentifulness, where we basically have no wars in our own country, where we have water and food, and everything is hunky-dory and everything is rather pleasant, and we live in El Dorado kind of thing, and let's all just be happy-go-lucky and enjoy our lives, and everything will be well ever after. People are beginning to see that this is not really how life is meant to be. Life is full of challenges and problems, and we've tried to iron them out by mechanizing everything and gosh, all the rest of it. But this is now turning around on us, and we're going to go through a whole phase of crisis after crisis and bad things. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen what was happening in Central Europe this week, but the floods in Germany, there've been huge floods in Germany, in Belgium, and also in the Netherlands, and in various other countries, some in Switzerland as well.
Wow.
And dozens of people have died. And what you see is, these floods with rivers bursting and entire villages being wiped away. And this comes from the climate crisis. This is what's been predicted, floods will happen. And, I'm as asleep as the next person. I've been thinking, oh, climate crisis. How can there be floods in mountainy areas? But, it comes rushing down the mountains and it wipes everything away. And then you think, well, I'm a girl who grew up in the Netherlands, which is 20 meters under sea level. So I've thought, oh, well, that's simple. You just make more dikes and you preserve yourself. But it doesn't work like that. Once the sea rises, it rises in the land as well. The water levels under the land rise. So everything becomes soggy. And eventually it floods in that way. It isn't the sea breaking in. There's so many ways in which these things can go wrong. So, with the ice melting and the polar caps, there is stuff happening that is going to really change how we live. And we need to prepare ourselves for it. There'll be other pandemics too, of course, because we've interfered with the animal kingdom so much. So we are going to have more things like that.
Yeah.
COVID will be around for decades. It will just keep changing like flu, We'll never get rid of it completely. We'll just have vaccinations every year for the new strains, but we'll never get rid of it completely. And there'll be more and more challenges like that. Life will get harder. And that's deplorable. It's horrible. And, something in me says, oh, well, I'm 70, I'm going to be okay, during my lifetime, it won't get too bad. But then I think, yeah, my grandchildren, who are young, they will have to deal with it. And that's terrible. I didn't want to leave them a world like that. So what can we do to get people to take stock, to think about it in a new way, to not be passive so that they will be reactive when it happens, but to be active about it ahead of time and to be prepared, to be much more prepared, and to be prepared in this emotional way and in this social, political way, to not let the bullies be in charge, which by and large they are, unfortunately, to not allow politicians to hide the problems so that we are taken aback when things burst out into the open, to have a thoughtful conversation about these things, to be philosophical about it, to be political about it, to be strategic about it. All of that needs to happen. And I think people are maturing towards wanting that again. They don't just want to have fun anymore. They do actually want to get it, and they want to be prepared.
Right.
Right. As far as, for example, let's take podcasting, for example. Before podcasting became a mainstream sort of thing to do, I believe people in media thought, oh, nobody has the attention span for these long form dialogues, right? Not all of a sudden, but it took some years. But it seems to be that there's a large interest in this medium,
right?
And there are people who listen
it's the
easily
same thing.
to an
Absolutely
hour, 2
right.
hour.
Why is that?
conversation.
Because people are fed up being fed, pap in the larger media, where they're given stuff to forget about everything. Whereas what you guys are doing is you're waking people up and you're saying, well, think about it this way. And people will have discussions when they listen to stuff. And we want that. We're hungry for it. We know that we're not being told exactly what is going on and that we need to figure it out for ourselves. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we can have these conversations. For decades we couldn't. In the 60s we did these things on television. We had amazing debates on television. From the 70s onwards it started disappearing. Still in France, it was there a bit in the 70s, but by the 80s, 90s, noughties, it was gone. Nobody in television was doing this. And now look, this is the kind of thing that's happening again. And this is the kind of thing that young people want. They want to inform themselves in ways that are not dictated by those in charge. They know full well that what they're being fed is not good for them. It's the same as with food, you know. A lot of the food people eat is rubbish because, you know, it's cheap to make it for them. But people wake up to these facts. They know they want better stuff. It's the same with the food for the mind. So you guys are doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Wow.
and not just us. There are other people. I could think of, I don't know, Sam Harris, for instance.
Yeah.
There are a lot of really good people who are sort of sending out ripples of good influence,
Right.
and they're having
Absolutely.
these incremental changes. And I think there's hope in that. And there's always, I think, one thing that'll stay constant as far as human beings go is there's a craving for authenticity, right? And if you're not getting that from the things society dictates to you, you're going to crave and look for it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand it is a long shot. I understand still, you know, even that being said, there probably are more people who are awake than there used to be. Maybe that's in my mind. I don't have the statistics for it, obviously.
Mm.
I know Steven Pinker says the world is getting
Getting
better
better,
as
right.
far as that goes, but then we do have climate change to contend with and
Well,
all
yeah.
that. So,
Well,
yeah.
I like to think he is right to some extent about that. I think people are more inclined to want to understand things than they ever were.
Right.
But there is also a lot more to understand, and there is a lot to confuse us and to um, keep us looking in the wrong direction. We are being distracted much more than we ever were. There
Yeah.
are still a lot of people who believe what they're being told, and there are still a lot of people who just want to watch daytime television and go into a daze, you know, having lots of beers. And there are a lot of people who find the world a very difficult place and who don't feel brave enough to stand up and be counted. But if you give them a way to do it, I think they will, though. I think you're right about that. I think people do want that sense of realness and that sense of feeling that, yes, this is important, or this is meaningful to me, or this touches my own life. This is something I have thought about. This is something that matters to me. That is absolutely right. And that is certainly happening to more people than ever before. To that extent, I agree with Steve.
Right. And then, so how can we instill sort of, I guess, a sense of existential courage and use some of these existential philosophical ideas to help people become less afraid and less so use denial as a defense, as a major defense?
Well, how can we do it? It's by educating people, giving them the tools. And that's about not just doing it in a highbrow way, but also in a lowbrow way. It's about people creating cartoons about it. It's about, you know, some mainstream people starting to play with it. It's about artists doing things with it. It's about people putting it in their pop songs. It's about it getting spread around in all the many multifarious ways that we have to be cultural. And that takes time, but I have no doubt at all that that is what is happening, because with the pandemic, actors and artists and many people have been through hell and back, and they're all really thinking about things. They're a lot of them are going through crises, and I think they will be picking up on all this stuff. And so there will be many people at many different layers of society who will get interested in this way of looking at it and who will be starting to talk about it and spread those messages. That will happen. And eventually it will get through to some of the good politicians, because there are some, you know, genuine politicians who want to make the world a better place. They tend to not last too long in politics, but there are some good ones. They will pick these ideas up, and they already have. You know, I have often in the last few years spoken to politicians. I've spoken in the European Parliament. I've spoken with a lot of members of Parliament, European members of Parliament. There are a lot of people in that field who were dumbfounded, who said, what do we do with all this? How can we stand up to all this that's going on in the world? A lot of politicians are at a loss, They feel overly responsible for what's happening in the world. They don't have all this knowledge that you need to have in order to change things for the better. It's a big job to change the world, to save the world. The politicians are not going to do it on their own.
Mhm.
It'll never happen. It needs all of us.
Mhm. And
It
then,
really
so
does.
right, and touching on the importance of community, how do existential crises cause people to become disconnected and sort of despondent? How did they how did they sort of disassociate them from the things that pretty much matter around them?
Absolutely right. So that's the first impulse. It's to disconnect because actually your world has been disconnected. So you want to really shelter, and you want to give yourself safety. So you tend to turn away. But you do that for a bit until you got some basic safety, and then you need to build communities. And it's not just about turning to the community you're a part of. It's about realizing that because of your crisis, you're usually not alone in your crisis. Crises are often shared by many people around you. You can actually create a new layer of community. You can create new channels, new ways of thinking about things, talking about things, and that becomes exhilarating. That really becomes exhilarating because then you feel you've actually been saved from your isolation. You discover these wonderful things. You discover friendship, solidarity. You discover shared ideals. You discover activism. You discover human rights. You discover that you have so much in common with other people who have been through crises, other people who are in a difficult situation. And when we can start building bridges between the different groups that are disenfranchised and help them see that they can help each other, then we're rebuilding a world that is worth living in. And then it feels like it's worth giving your life's energy to it because it feels good. Rather than it feeling exhausting, it feels good.
Oh. And then how do we understand reactive populism and all of this, right? So, because obviously on the one hand, it's just pretty much this menace, but then on the other hand, you also understand how people feel disempowered and disenfranchised and, kind of just in a way ineffective, right? So how do we hold those two paradoxes or that paradox together, those two contradictions?
Well, it's the same thing, really. Like most contradictions, it's two sides of the same coin. So one thing I began to understand after having railed against populism for the first 2 years, I
Hmm.
began to understand that the politicians are completely lost. And they have been taught by the psychologists, ironically, that, you don't have to make it all up. You just ask the people what they want. And then, you do these surveys, or you have these groups, and you listen to what their frustrations are and what they want. And then you give them what they want. And this is how you create a populist politics. But a populist politics is not going to give the people what they need, because the people have not yet been given the tools or the education to think through their problems. They're just stuck with their problems, and they say to the politicians, oh, give us a bit more money for this, or do a bit more of that. Or if you kicked out these darker people, then we would feel a lot better because, there wouldn't be so many people competing for the jobs. And then these politicians, who really are quite ignorant, as I said before, a lot of the time, they think, oh, well, that will make me popular. Maybe they're right. Maybe that is what I should be saying I'm doing. And then before they know it, that is what they're doing. So it's the dog wagging the tail, the other way around, the tail wagging the dog.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if things have been turned upside down. It's become topsy-turvy. People do not know why they're doing what they're doing. Politicians are in the dark. They're just constantly changing their minds about things. As I said, it's really difficult to know enough to oversee the future, to oversee all the problems. Having gotten that close into the political process, I've sat in meetings where people were tearing their hair out and saying, but what can we possibly do about it? If we do X, then Y will happen. If we do A, then B will happen. We can't win this. So really, we should just stop this and stop people protesting or stop. And they get panicky about it. They can't engage because if they engage, they lose their perspective. They get drawn into people's misery. It is like politicians are untrained psychotherapists doing psychotherapy with a bunch of suicidal people, and they get attacked from all over the place. It reminded me a bit of when I first started working in psychiatry about 50 years ago, and I was thrown in at the deep end. I had to run a group pretty well on my own. And it became so popular. There were like 80 schizophrenics in the group at times, a large group experiences. There were some nurses in the room, but it was still my responsibility. And I would throw up every Saturday morning. I had to run it from 10 to 12. And at 9 o'clock, like clockwork, I felt sick for the responsibility. I look at some of the politicians I know, and I can see the same thing. They have no idea what the hell they're doing, and nobody's trained them. They don't understand what people need. They don't understand about justice. They don't understand about how to really make equality a reality. And then, they're often led by very greedy people who really just want to use the power trip to get a load of money for themselves and their mates. And they're devious and they use nasty tricks, dirty tricks. And it's very difficult to stand up to that kind of bully. That's, your high level kind of bully. And so they give up. A lot of the politicians give up. They just make do. They just do the minimum and they just try to get by. And it's not good enough, guys. It's not good enough when a psychotherapist tries to get by. They've got to understand people's problems and they've got to stand strong with it and have a sense of how they can help people really to understand their lives. If they can't, then they might make things worse. Well, I think we often have politicians who are making things worse rather than making things better, and who think in the short term and in terms of their own popularity or longevity, rather than in terms of what can actually be done.
Yeah, wow. Because I mean, here, we've obviously Trump has been removed for already some time. So what's the situation there with Boris Johnson? I mean, what are his approval ratings? They must be incredibly low.
He is incredibly popular still.
Wow.
This is what is completely, well, sometimes I think these must be numbers that are just being fabricated. I just cannot believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I think, well, people identify with him. They see him making mistake after mistake and they think, oh yeah, he's just like us. He's nothing like them. He is a privileged person who is very much interested in staying a privileged person. I actually think that he must have a very hard time of it because, he's going through hell and back. And I wouldn't like to be in his position. I wouldn't like how to sort things out. It's very difficult.
Right.
It's a very difficult situation by now. He's messed up so much, How is he going to sort it out?
Right. How is he still that popular, though? I can't even imagine that being the case.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's not just him though, it's the whole damn government.
Hmm. Wow. And I mean,
It's really bad. Well, I don't have to tell you anything. You've been through this in the USA. Come on, you know what it's like. You
yeah.
just you just don't understand it. You want to throw your hand up in the air and say, well, we'll just have to wait until it finishes, because what can we do?
Right.
You just got to get rid of this government and that's it.
I
But then
think
we're
it's
not out of the woods, because, we still got the problems. That's what you see now, okay, so you got a much better government, but you're not out of the woods. There's still lots of problems to resolve.
I think it's the amount of compliance, like people, like figures like Boris Johnson or Trump had with people. And whoever was with them or is with them, they invested so much in them that for them to deny them now, it's as if, it'd be like a form of death, so to speak.
Yeah,
At least in terms of their identities.
Identity.
Right.
I think that's right. And I think we need to go back to what we said earlier. We also need to try to understand why that is, because not all of those people have profit or profiteering motives. Some people truly believe that that kind of right-wing approach is the right way forward, and we need to really come to grips with this. As long as there are so many people in so many countries who truly believe that we need to put an elite in power, and there should be an elite that's much richer than the others, and we should just have measures that eliminate some of the plebs and one of the lower ranks, because they're rubbish people anyway, so let them die in a pandemic, fine, it doesn't matter. This is, why do people believe that? And how can we engage with that philosophy? These are real ideological issues that nobody is really talking about properly. There are many people who believe these things. There are many people who believe that if only we put the right people in charge and we get rid, we let a lot of people die, then the world will be a better place. And this sort of ideology will get much stronger when we see, billions and billions and billions more people, and we see so much pressure on the world's resources and things getting harder. This is going to become a challenge in the future. Ideology.
Yeah, and I also wonder if when Brexit finally comes to fruition, if let's say, millions of people are kind of expelled, would there be an economic collapse because of it?
It already is happening.
Is it? Okay.
There are many shops that haven't got as much food in them as they used to have.
Right.
They can't get the nurses to work in the NHS anymore.
Right.
These were all EU citizens who held those jobs. They can't find fruit pickers, so we don't get the fresh fruit coming into the shops.
Wow.
There are already lots and lots of problems like that, but they're being covered up by COVID at the moment.
Oh, wow. So
the country is in real trouble, and it will become obvious over the next years. It's very slow, though.
Well, I mean, do you anticipate there being some sort of regression then? Would, I guess, the citizens in itself kind of like turn back after seeing where it's going?
I think people will wake up at some point and there will be a revolt. Then there will be a new government. There might be a difficult time to get to it, but there will be a new government, and that new government will have to rejoin the single market almost immediately. This country cannot survive without having economic arrangements with 27 of its next door neighbors. It cannot survive without being part of the single market. It will have to do that.
Right. And then if we're looking at kind of existential crises as a form, or kind of as the catalyst for transformation, the idea hopefully is people become not only more politically aware, but also more globally aware. And you understand how, kind of we all depend on each other, regardless of whatever your race is or nationality.
This is it. We all depend on each other. We're one network. We're one network around the world. There are no borders of nations. The earth is one place. And these borders are artificial. And what you put in the air comes over to a different country. If there is a nuclear disaster, as we saw with Chernobyl in Russia, it will come to every other country.
Right.
It goes around. There are no barriers. We cannot stop it. And when climate change really bites, there won't be national barriers to the movements of people that we will see in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. But of course, when you look at history, you will see that mass movements of people have happened historically on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's such a great cutoff point. So, because it was just so wonderful.
Yeah.
Any final?
Time passes.
Yeah, time passes.
Wow.
Time passes pretty quickly.
Wow.
Any final questions for me before we wrap up?
Well, there's a lot I wanted to say, but okay, fair enough. I noticed in your book there was some mention of Eckhart Tolle. How did you become acquainted with his work?
It was really my mother who got into his work when she was in the final years of her life. She died at 92. And in the last 2 or 3 years, she became quite an admirer of several people like Eckhart Tolle and Thich Nhat Hanh and people like that. And we were always talking out. So I read these books that she was reading and we would discuss them. And, I was interested in she and her friends, all the elderly ladies in the house where she lived, they were all into these things. So interesting, these people, as they were getting closer to death, they found their old religions were no good for them.
Wow.
And they all got interested in these spiritual ideas. And this is what they all needed to help them towards death. So that inspired me.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean his framing is not bad. It doesn't have too much of that
like mystical.
It's not. I mean, it's there, but it's
not
also
very
practical.
Deep. It's quite a sort of easy kind of. It's a message made easy for the masses, I think.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, we need this message to get across in so many different ways. We are not in competition with each other. We need all the good voices we can get to pass the messages across by images, by films, by easy books, by middling books, by difficult books, by debates, it needs to be done by everyone who is willing to do it. So, there's room under the sun for all those people.
Yeah, of course, so people can resonate.
Yeah.
Right. They can find what they resonate with. Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. For, I guess, different levels of like engagement.
Sure. Like you said earlier, somebody might do it through a pop song and somebody may find their answer there. They might find a way to be present.
And many young people, when I think back to my own teenage years, it was the Beatles, of course, but, many of the messages in the pop songs stayed stuck in your head and you go over them and they gave you strength and they got you through things. These things are remarkably important. They are one of the ways in which we create community today, and they matter.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that even though makes me think of the Vietnam War and that Black Sabbath song, War Pigs, right? Have you ever heard it? Yeah,
of
generals
course.
gathered in their masses. And it's like literally you have a whole group of people singing in unison.
Absolutely amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
well, people like Joan Baez and
that's right.
They were amazing.
Yeah, and I would also mention Tupac Shakur as well, because I have to. So he was another revolutionary figure.
All right. Well, Emmy, if we wanted to,
well, this could be a whole other thing, talking about pop music and psychotherapy.
Absolutely.
And movies and psychotherapy.
Oh, definitely. 100%, definitely.
So if we wanted to follow you and follow your work, where could we find you?
Okay, so you can find me everywhere, really, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. That's Emmy Zen. And you can find me on YouTube as well. I got over 100 little clips on various topics. You're very welcome to follow me on YouTube and to ask me for something on something that preoccupies you and that worries you. And I'll be happy to do a little clip.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emmy, for coming back on.
Pleasure.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
That was
right.
epic.
Wow. That was awesome. I didn't notice the time pass.
I know. You're like, wait, what?
Even at the end there, I instead of saying take care, I said take well. But yeah, so everyone, please buy the book. Again, it's called Rising From Existential Crisis, Life Beyond Calamity. It's out now on Amazon, wherever else, other booksellers. And if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell.
And thank you so
See
much
you
for
next
watching.
time.